Bill, Ulf, welcome back.
Thank you. Great to see you, Brian.
Yeah, great to see you, Brian.
You
Thanks very
guys
much.
are repeat offenders on this show. So it's always fantastic to get your opinions and insights. Um, Today we're going to talk a little bit about vulnerabilities and exposure management and kind of how they've been evolving and where we are today and that sort of thing. But I'd like to kick things off with a very short demo, like a 3-minute demo of what we mean when we're talking about vulnerability exposure management, especially from Sevco's perspective. And I think it's a really unique approach to how organizations have thought of this in the past. So let me just go ahead and pop this up real quick, and then I'll go through this, and then we can just sort of chat about it and talk through it. So this is the Sevco security platform. This is where we do asset intelligence. This is where we do vulnerability and exposure management across assets and identities and applications and everything in between. And recently we've added this vulnerability exposure capability. So here we have 13,000 plus devices in total. And we can look at the breakdown. We're getting this information from CrowdStrike, Jamf, Amazon, Tenable, all these different sources. And from about 37,000 plus records, that brings us down to 13,771 actual devices. Now, if we look at our inventory, you guys are familiar with our device inventory. Each row of those 13,771 devices, each row is dedicated to a specific asset. And we see, okay, this is coming from CrowdStrike, this is Tenable, this is Automox. And if I click on any one device, I get all the information. This is a Dell Latitude. The last communication with the management console was about 11 minutes ago. Is it running configuration management and patch management? In this case, it's not. Does it have any CVEs? It's a critical asset. It's an enterprise endpoint. It's on-prem in Minneapolis. Who are the users or user, in this case, Jared? And we see it's got endpoint, no config management, but it's also in directory services. We also see that it's going to be end of life on October 7th. And then we can get the device details. And I really like this view because I can say, well, just show me what CrowdStrike would have told me, or Active Directory or Sentinel-1. This is the CrowdStrike view. And show me everything that's being correlated now to give me this information. But honestly, the part that I like most is this left-hand column because it just aggregates it all for me. All my environmental vulnerabilities, like no config management, all my CVE and software vulnerabilities, nice list from high severity to low. And then, of course, we have all those great asset details, right? All the fundamentals you'd expect from an asset intelligence solution. But then we flip this. Now let's look at this from a vulnerability perspective. So we have almost 9,000 vulnerabilities. And here's just one, Google Chromium V8 type confusion vulnerability. CVSS scores, temporal scores, probability, has it been weaponized? We have full integration with VulnCheck. So it pulls in a lot of intelligence and data beyond just the general CVE information, as well as the patch data that, of course, we're very interested in seeing. And I really like this because here's the known exploits section. This says, is this something that's publicly available? Is it commercial? Meaning, can I buy it on the dark web? Is it just a white paper or has it actually been weaponized? Is there like a Metasploit plugin? Is there a Python script? And then, of course, there's 13 exploits here. And we see all that rich information, of course, that we're pulling in from VulnCheck. Now, one of the things that I can go beyond this is say, show me a reported exploitation. I can get reports from NSA, from VulnCheck, from CISA. Here's an NSA report. This is a Chinese state sponsor. And this particular group uses this actual attack. So that's good to know. Affected software, it's Google Chromium. So of course it affects Google Chrome. It looks like versions 10 and version 11. And we see the temporal scores again, the base score, the EPSS scores, adding all those pieces together. Last thing I want to look at is this exposure view. So now we're looking at things instead of from a software vulnerability from things like no endpoint protection, no configuration management. And we see in the no endpoint protection part, severity score. That can be critical, high, medium, or low. That takes in all those different parameters we saw before. Accepted risk, which issues have we resolved? Are we tracking this? Is it going into service now, for example? Other information. And I like this information at the bottom too, which says things like, hey, by the way, half of your devices are mission configuration and patch management. So a great little way to get some visibility. Then we got some stats. You got 588 devices that you need to look at out of a total of 2,047 with this vulnerability. 112 had been added in the last 30 days. 9 had been resolved. And of those 9 that resolved, it looks like it takes you about 2 weeks. And this is a great way of saying, okay, I've got some automated remediation validation now. Because as IT starts adding patches, fixing CVEs, installing software updates, updating the configuration management IT software, updating the endpoint security software. I can see things automatically be added and removed from this list. So when IT says, oh, yeah, we fixed them all, you're like, yeah, you fixed the 9, but we added 112 today. And it lets you just track and validate that. And the other piece is you get the nice metrics, things like, hey, it took us 2 weeks to address 9 issues. Well, maybe that's good. Maybe that's bad. And what can we do to improve those stats? Maybe it's a training issue. Maybe it's not having the right tools. Maybe it's a process problem, things like that. So that's vulnerability and exposure management from a sort of a Sevco perspective. So now let's just chat about that instead of just going through a product demo. So my first question to both of you guys, and maybe Bill will just kick things off with you. You've been in cyber long before we ever start calling it cyber. But what are some of the sources that you're seeing organizations get CVE information from today? What are the different locations they're pulling that data in from?
Well, a lot of them are pulling it from publicly available threat intel, and that's interesting because that's not always the most up to date and the most accurate source. Some, of course, are buying it from the various threat intel organizations who package it, evaluate it, validate it, and then sell it. And then some, I guess, go through the difficulty of trying to get it off of the NIST sites.
Awesome. Ulf, from your perspective, where are you seeing people pulling the CVE data from?
Yeah, I think it's the same kind of sources that Bill mentioned, but I think a big problem is not having too little of that data, but having too much of it and being able to manage it. And it's overwhelming for a lot of organizations. I mean, depending on what kind of staffing and resources they have. So I think it's very important to be able to sort through all that and prioritize and figure out what's most critical now, and what really needs to be addressed given their the actual potential of that vulnerability to cause harm.
And I think one of the real shortfalls in the whole system is the grading system for how severe a CVE is severely lacking. I mean, some of it is spot on. Obviously, when a CVE has been the underlying cause of an attack, it certainly lifts its severity on the scale. But if it hasn't been used in an attack, but still is severe, it often doesn't get labeled that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll just both of your points, but Ulf, you made a great one. You can have too much of a good thing, especially if there's no way to really process and prioritize that.
Right.
Years ago, we got CV information from our scanners, Tenable, Qualys, Rapid7, many others.
Yes.
And you'd scan a bunch of IP addresses, you'd get a list and it said this IP has this vulnerabilities, this IP has that vulnerabilities. It was a pretty basic step. But now you still get vulnerabilities from those solutions as well. They're great at doing that. But your EDR products like CrowdStrike, your patch management tools like Automox, Jamf on the application side, AWS, and hundreds of others. So most organizations that I'm seeing have a minimum of a half a dozen sources of CVEs. And you have to be able to correlate that, deduplicate that, and then to Bill's point, you've got all these different scores. Well, this is an 8, but this guy here says it's a 7.5, and this one says it's a 6. Well, what does any of that mean, right? You have to be able to correlate all that. That's still good to know, but also I need the business context. Is it a critical asset? Does it have customer data? Is it part of my supply chain? Is it in a country where we've just started to expand? We have some concerns about. There's all these sort of non-technical bits. And then correlate that CVE information with what we just showed in the demo, the exposure stuff, to say, yeah, this is a very severe, this is a critical level issue, but it's got up-to-date EDR, it's got segmentation and this and that. This one's only a high, but it's missing a bunch of key information, such as EDR, patch management, and it's a very sensitive asset. So all that has to be considered for the prioritization. And I think you both kind of framed it like, look, we want this data. We're not saying we don't want to look at it, but we need to be able to, prioritize it and actually operationalize it, or else it's just a bunch of data sitting in a file that we can't really leverage, and nobody wants that.
Right.
Which kind of brings me to my follow-up. And Ulf, why don't we start with you on this one? But how are you seeing organizations trying to manage all those vulnerabilities and their patching and their prioritization? Historically, what have they been doing, and what kind of issues have they come across?
Well, we hear from a lot of organizations that, asset management, which was, Sevco's starting point, and then vulnerability management are real difficult challenges for most organizations. It comes down to, metrics, being able to take the right actions, and then also compliance, plays a big part in this. How can you make sure that your actual processes are compliant with all the frameworks that you need to adhere to in your industry, and sometimes it's being able to answer those simple questions, right? It's seemingly simple from the executive boardroom level, that you hear about a new severe vulnerability. Okay, how are we exposed? How does that affect us? What do we have, and where are we really vulnerable? As you just described, it has to do with asset criticality, what controls are on there, what an attacker could get access to, and sometimes you can even take the presumed attacker's capabilities into account. So a lot of things that play in here, and then of course there's a connection to software inventory, not just devices, but also software, things like SBOM, software bill of materials, and all the related technologies to that. That's a big area right now with a lot of development. But again, to answer these simple questions, what do we have and what is vulnerable?
Yeah. So, Bill, what's your hot take on that? How have organizations tried to manage this in the past? You're of course familiar with the public sector and private sector approach to this, but how have they approached it historically?
Well, of course, they use a lot of data processing tools, databases and correlation tools and so on. The problem is that there's no one tool that solves all problems. And most of the tools that are available that solve a part of the problem don't integrate well with the others that solve the rest of the problem. And the poor customer is left to do the integration of various tools that are available. I must say that the thing that impresses you about the Sevco demo that you just gave is the sheer volume of data, and trying to get the people who are trained well enough in all of those various attributes of your system and what to do if they find something is not easy. And I think we're all realizing that the ratio of vulnerabilities to available people to solve the vulnerabilities is getting out of whack. That leads me to instead of looking backwards, how we've done it in the past, I think there is room for someone to come into the market with some artificial intelligence or machine learning tools, because a lot of these processes of walking through vulnerabilities and walking through the ways in which you address them could be automated using artificial intelligence and machine learning, not necessarily large language models, which are merely predictive dialogues, but instead real machine learning, deep learning kinds of approaches in which you build your own neural network model to address them.
Yeah, certainly it becomes a question of scale, because we look at the volume, the velocity, the variety of these threats, and it's almost untenable in many cases to try to.
Well, and training will be a challenge for anyone who's trying to build an artificial intelligence system.
Well, Bill, let's double click on that a little bit. One of the things that I mentioned in that short demo was the business context and being able to say, okay, here's all your software vulnerabilities, here's all your exposures, missing patch management, or your EDR hasn't communicated in the last 3 weeks to the management console, or it's in detection mode instead of prevention. All these types of variables is great. It's all the technical bits. But correlating that with the business context to say it's a critical asset, it's in a critical location, it's part of supply chain, it belongs to our executive team, and a million other variables. How important is that actually when you're trying to prioritize and manage these threats?
Well, it's extremely important, and I think the best illustration of just how important it is some of the supply chain
Hmm.
issues that we've had over the last couple of years. Those issues should have been identifiable in advance, uh, but they weren't because we weren't focused on supply chain. I have to applaud the administration, the president's executive memo, executive order on supply chain and on software bill of materials and so on is really spot on in terms of trying to get ahead of some of these problems that really cause the huge breaches that we've had. I don't know about your social security number, but mine certainly has been exposed. And that was caused by a supply chain issue.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. So Ulf, from your side, you're involved with so many disparate projects. When you're talking about getting your arms around the massive amount of data, correlating, prioritizing, how important is it to have that business level context injected into that to help you make those decisions and get better prioritization?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's extremely important because really, again, coming back to the just the overwhelming amount of vulnerabilities being discovered and announced all the time, the amount of different types of software that many companies have through, through acquisitions, through organic growth, whatever it is, any large organization has very complex configurations of software. So just being able to manage this complexity is difficult, and of course complexity is really a challenge for any defenders in cybersecurity because of this simple thing that attackers only need a few ways, one way or a couple of ways into the system, whereas the defender kind of has to cover everything. And that's why it's so important for defenders to be able to manage these large amounts of data and really quickly move to the things that are most critical from their business perspective, right?
Yeah.
And again, you may have a system that's not really critical at all. It's not good to have any system attacked, but you may be fine with having some exposure there, whereas you have other systems and your critical functions, critical data that where you just can't afford to have even some sort of medium severity exposure. So being able to make those prioritizations and just manage all that, that's really important.
Yeah.
Well, and I had a CISO tell me a few years ago, so it must be even worse now, that this was a CISO of a large bank. And he said that they had bought over the preceding couple of years or 3 years about 120 cybersecurity software tools to address the issues that they had in their systems, and most of them were sitting on the shelf because he didn't have the people who were trained in how to use them, or he didn't have the people who were trained in how to use the results of their, even if they worked well, use the results to actually fix the vulnerabilities in their system.
Wow. Wow. That's a lot of tools to be shelfware for sure. And yeah, you see that across the board. And we've all been in this long enough where we know that it used to be and still is sometimes today. People will come in and they'll do a vulnerability scan. They'll give a report to the team. Then they'll come back again 6 months later, a year later. They'll do a vulnerability scan, and guess what? They just have to change the date because nobody fixed anything. So let's take everything we've talked about so far. We've collected the data, we've correlated, we've prioritized it. It's great. Now security perhaps has handed over to IT. Let's take it to the next step. One of the things I mentioned in the demo, is this notion of automated remediation validation, which is a fancy way of saying, tell me that you fixed the thing that you said you were going to fix. Uh, I really think that that is going to become essential to operations because Ulf, both you and Bill were talking about just the volume of data and trying to get your arms around this, and Bill, all the different tools you might have. But being able to say, here's a set of problems, please go fix those and let me see in real time that they're actually getting fixed, that they're actually getting addressed, so I can monitor that. Do you see that as this sort of next evolution in how we're managing these threats? We're actually managing the process is just as important as actually discovering the threats. Bill, maybe start with you on that.
It's certainly an important step,
Mm.
you know, and an essential step. Uh, but this is such a complex area. It's the first step, really, toward bringing it all together. And remind me, I'll talk about open source here in a minute or two.
Okay. Okay. Ulf, how about you?
Yeah.
These processes of automation validation.
Right. Well, it again comes back to these seemingly simple questions, right? You can say, all right, this year we've invested this much in the security budget. How much better off are we now compared to a year ago? And it would be nice to be able to easily see those metrics, and at least according to some metrics in terms of, exposure from critical vulnerabilities, that yes, we're better off now. Okay, can we verify that? Is that not just you saying that, but can we see now if we if we have a way to actually confirm that that's the case? And that also addresses this thing where we get security problems from just omissions, just regular human error, quality things. Yes, I was this vulnerability was supposed to be fixed, maybe it didn't get fixed. It's very important to be able to verify that that's the case. All verification, testing, validation. I mean, we know that's important for software functions, but it's really important for security as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm one of those people who believes in metrics and has lived my life using them from time to time. But years ago, I created an expression. I wrote it on well, at that time it was a blackboard, but on my whiteboard, let's say. And the expression was quantifying qualitative information doesn't lessen its uncertainties. Dot, 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 but it does allow you to multiply them.
True.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Bill, you were going to say something a moment ago about open source. I'm interested in hearing your take on that.
Yeah, one of the statistics that's kind of interesting is that it is believed that 80% of today's application software is open source code.
Hmm.
And it was long ago believed that open source was going to be great for the world because look at all the eyeballs that were going to look at it and make sure that it was secure and good code.
Yeah.
But the truth of the matter is open source is a source of a huge number of those CVEs that you were talking about. And so that's why I'm so attached to this whole notion of the software bill of materials being an important step toward having a way of inventorying what we're delivering. And unfortunately, I believe we're going to find out that if 80% of the application is open source, 80% of the applications are probably going to be quite vulnerable.
Mm, mm. Interesting. I didn't realize it was 80%. I knew it was a big chunk, but yeah, that's
Yeah, well, why rewrite all that code that does nothing more than return a value?
yeah. Well, and the problem is that we all know is a lot of the time people will borrow pieces of that code, copy and paste. They're not really analyzing it. So vulnerabilities that exist in one application now exist in 100 different applications because everyone's doing that because it's a time saver, right? And people are incentivized to get code done quickly, not necessarily securely.
And this means we're just going to see more of these kinds of widespread vulnerabilities like log4j and
Mm,
similar things like that. It
sure.
it pops up in some extremely commonly used software library, and then it turns out that vulnerabilities potentially everywhere, right?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. We really see a lot of that on the IoT side, where there's a lot of reused code because a lot of these IoT products aren't developed by tech companies. They're just saying, well, we're building a phone. Can we, can we take some code from that printer and from that
Mhm.
digital door lock and from this and that and kind of smush it together, which is what they do, or they white label it. Um, Guys, as we wrap up here, and I'll start with you on this, Ulf. Uh, for those that are listening and they're trying to get their arms around asset management, vulnerability management, exposure management, and all these types of really complex and large volume based issues. What are maybe some steps that an organization can take, or maybe some just first steps that they can look at to try to start addressing this problem in a way that's not they're just not banging their heads against the wall.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would typically start sort of top down, then bottom up in a sense, and again formulate these seemingly simple questions, but that can be so hard to answer. You know,
Yeah.
what are all the what's all the software that we're running? What are all the versions? What does it contain? How do we get we get information about CVEs, about vulnerabilities, threat intel? Um, how how can we automate how we act on that, and
Mm.
um, how can we measure our progress? How can we identify our most business critical assets? How can we look at the real exposure in context, taking everything, etc. And then when once you have those questions that you need to answer, then you can sort of look at how do we get that information, and how do we build it up. What kind of sensors and other measurements do we need? What kind of analysis tools, etc. And then sort of build it from there. That would be my recommended approach, because just you know buying, as you mentioned, hundreds of products, and then trying to fit it all together, that may be where some organizations are, but that's really challenging.
Yeah. Bill, how about you? Where should organizations start?
I think they should start with an analysis of the threat to their information, not the general threat. What is it that someone wants from you? And how are you protecting it? Pardon me. And what's the architecture that you have that's built around that very important information? And then start doing some of the analysis and and other correlation and other things that are important to let's face it, guessing whether or not that very important information is going to be attacked, and whether or not the architecture and the work you do to keep it fresh and healthy is going to be effective.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And
I think both of you come from this from a very stories from the trenches perspective. You've seen organizations go through this. You've done this yourselves, and it sounds like everyone agrees. Don't just jump into the technical bits. Don't just jump into buying product, but understand what your business is trying to do, where the threats are, who might be impacting you, and then work it from the top down, right? And then say, okay, to have this type of capability, we need this type of software, this type of solution, as opposed to let's buy a whole bunch of servers and a whole bunch of software to put on them, a whole bunch of cloud services, and hopefully something will stick, which
well, and you have to make sure that you have the decision tools or the people who can make the right decisions to keep it effective. One of my engineers, when I was running a cybersecurity company in Silicon Valley, came to me and said, I want to build a system that will allow us to do in the digital world what we do in the physical world, and that is I'm going to put it in safe drawers, and only the people who are authorized to see it will get to see it, because we will guard it in that safe drawer. No one will get into it except those who are authorized. And I turned to him and I said, so who's going to make the decision about who is authorized to see what? And he said, oh, well, the CIO. And I said, get the hell out of my office.
So I'd like to just return to your point about verification, Brian. We know from a vulnerability management point of view, there's going to be some announcement, on a weekend, over a holiday or something about here's the next big vulnerability that affects this commonly used library. And you need to sort of run through those scenarios before it happens, right? So you can answer, okay, where are we vulnerable? How can we quickly address this, because here's something widespread that's out in the wild. That's going to happen, and you have to run through those scenarios because you don't want to be caught unprepared when it happens, because it will happen, right?
Yeah, for sure. Well, guys, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom with us once again. And I look forward to having you on the next show. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Brian. Our pleasure.
Thank you, Brian.